It was just past sunset when Steven Seagal pulled into a small, dusty roadside diner off the Nevada highway. The sky glowed orange, the desert heat finally cooling as the evening rolled in. Steven had been riding for hours, preferring the solitude of the open road rather than any crowded city. He wore a simple black jacket, his long ponytail tied neatly behind him, sunglasses still resting on his face even though the sun had almost disappeared. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another quiet traveler stopping for a late dinner. What he didn't know was that inside the diner sat a group of men who were the farthest thing from quiet. At least a dozen motorcycles were parked outside, chrome-polished, engines still ticking from the heat, and their owners had practically taken over the entire diner. The Iron Vultures, a local biker gang known more for starting trouble than for finishing their meals, were laughing loudly, slapping tables, and intimidating anyone who dared glance their way too long. As Steven stepped inside, the door's bell chimed softly. The noise inside barely dipped. Steven ignored the chaos, choosing an empty stool near the counter. He simply wanted a cup of tea and maybe a chance to stretch his legs. But the bikers noticed him. One of them, a towering man with a braided beard and tattoos crawling up his neck, nudged his friend with an elbow. "Look at this guy," he muttered. "Old man thinks he's in a movie or something." Another biker smirked. Probably lost. Or scared. Steven didn't react. He calmly asked the waitress for hot tea, his voice low and gentle. She looked nervous, glancing at the bikers before nodding quickly. But trouble always finds those who don't look for it. As Steven waited for his tea, one biker deliberately walked past him, accidentally, bumping hard into his shoulder. The impact was enough to make any normal man lose balance. But Steven didn't move an inch. He simply turned his head, slowly, raising one eyebrow. The biker scoffed. "Watch where you're sitting, old man." Steven's voice was calm. Too calm. "I wasn't in your way." A few diners fell silent. The tension thickened. The biker gang wanted a reaction. What Steven did next shocked everyone watching. The biker who bumped into Steven Seagal didn't expect him to stay so calm. In fact, his lack of reaction annoyed the man even more. Bullies feed on fear, and Steven had given him none, not even a frown. The biker's nostrils flared. "You ignoring me, huh?" he growled, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. A few other bikers turned their heads, their conversations dying down. They enjoyed a good show, especially one where they got to humiliate someone who looked out of place. The Iron Vultures were used to being the loudest, toughest presence wherever they went. Steven didn't look at him. Instead, he gently blew on his cup of hot tea the waitress had finally placed before him. "I'm not ignoring anyone," he said softly. "I'm just trying to enjoy some peace." For a moment, there was a small, dangerous silence. The biker's lips curled into a malicious grin. "Peace," he barked. "You hear that, boys? This old man wants peace." Laughter exploded around the diner, echoing off the walls. A few customers sitting near the windows flinched, unsure if they should leave or pretend nothing was happening. Another biker, a bulky man with a denim vest full of patches, leaned back in his chair and called out, "Where you headed, Grandpa?" "Bingo night." The rest of the gang howled. But Steven remained still, calm, controlled, almost unbothered. It was this calmness that irritated them the most. The first biker, emboldened by the audience, stepped closer. Too close. He placed a hand on the counter beside Steven, leaning in, his breath thick with beer. "You think you're better than us, huh?" he accused. "Sitting here like some kind of—" "I didn't say that," Steven interrupted. "I don't think that." The biker blinked, surprised he spoke. Steven took another slow sip of his tea. This infuriated the man. "Stand up," he ordered. Steven set his cup down gently. "No. No." The biker's face turned red. "You're refusing?" "I don't want any trouble," Steven repeated. The gang leaders exchanged looks. This was no longer about intimidation. It was about dominance. They had to teach a lesson, or risk losing their image in front of everyone. A third biker, the lean one with a snake tattoo running down his arm, spoke from across the diner. "Hey, old man, you deaf? When Razor tells you to stand up, you stand up." Stephen calmly wiped his fingers with a napkin. "I heard him." Razor, the first biker, grabbed Stephen's shoulder and squeezed hard. But Stephen didn't flinch. Not even a twitch. The entire diner went silent. A woman near the door whispered to her husband. He's not scared at all." The husband nodded slowly. "Something's not right. This guy's too calm." Razor tightened his grip. "You trying to act tough, huh?" Stephen finally turned to look him directly in the eyes. "I'm telling you the last time," he said in a low voice. "I don't want to hurt you." Razor burst out laughing. "You hurt me? Buddy, you're in the wrong place to be saying big words." The gang cheered. They loved the bravado. But Stephen's tone hadn't changed. He wasn't threatening. He was warning. The waitress nervously approached the bikers. "Guys, please, let's not do this here." Razor snapped at her. "Stay out of this." The waitress backed away, trembling. Stephen gently placed both hands flat on the counter. Not fast, not dramatic, just precise, controlled, intentional. "This is your opportunity," he said quietly. "Walk away." The gang fell silent. Razor leaned closer until his forehead nearly touched Stephen's. "And if I don't?" Stephen sighed, almost sadly. "Then you'll regret it." The biker gang erupted in laughter again, banging tables and cheering Razor on. But the diners, they sensed something else. Some strange tension, something electric. They couldn't understand why this quiet man wasn't afraid. Why he didn't stutter. Why he didn't tremble. Why he didn't even blink. Two teenagers near the back started recording with their phones. Razor didn't like being mocked in front of his own gang. So he reached for Stephen's arm again. But this time, Stephen moved. It was barely a movement at all. A shift. A subtle turn. Less than a second. Suddenly Razor's wrist was locked in Stephen's hand, twisted just enough to make Razor gasp in pain, but not enough to break anything. The entire diner froze. Razor's knees buckled. Stephen spoke calmly near his ear. "I told you. Please don't do this." Razor couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The pain was unbelievable. Stephen released him. Razor stumbled back, clutching his arm, eyes wide with shock and humiliation. The gang members stood up from their chairs, furious. The tension was now volcanic. The room filled with adrenaline, fear, and disbelief. The Iron Vultures had just realized something terrifying. This wasn't an old man. This wasn't a random traveler. This was someone who moved like lightning. Someone dangerous. And they had no idea just how big a mistake they had made. Razor staggered backward, clutching his wrist in disbelief. The pain shot up his arm like a firecracker, and for a moment, he simply stared at Stephen as if trying to understand what had just happened. Nobody in the Iron Vultures had ever seen Razor, one of their most aggressive members, get handled that effortlessly. The rest of the gang rose to their feet, chairs scraping sharply against the floor. Their heavy boots thudded as they approached like a pack of wolves circling prey. But it wasn't Stephen showing fear. It was the crowd that backed away. Some diners rushed toward the exit. Others clung to walls, phones held high, filming every second. The waitress hid behind the counter, covering her mouth. But Stephen didn't even turn around. He simply placed his teacup down calmly, as if the world wasn't moments from erupting. The gang's vice leader, a scarred man named Briggs, stepped forward. His voice was a low growl, radioactive with anger. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, old-timer." Stephen didn't look at him. "I didn't attack anyone. I defended myself." "Oh, he's defending himself." Briggs mocked loudly, looking back at the gang. "He thinks that little wrist twist is going to scare us." The bikers jeered and shouted, pounding their fists against tables, pumped with adrenaline and ego. But one biker, a younger guy named Tank, whispered to the man beside him, "Did you see how fast he moved? That wasn't normal." Briggs silenced him with a glare. "Shut up. He's just a frail tourist trying to act tough." Still seated, Stephen folded the napkin in front of him, his hands steady, methodical, almost meditative. This unnerved the gang more than open aggression ever could. Briggs leaned in so close that Stephen could feel the heat of his breath. "Stand up." Stephen glanced at him, calm as a monk. "If I stand up, someone's getting hurt." "Yeah," Briggs snarled. "You." Stephen sighed softly, as if disappointed, not frightened. Razor, too embarrassed to remain on the sidelines, shoved forward again. His eyes were blazing with humiliation, fueled by the need to regain respect in front of his men. "You think you can make a fool out of me?" Razor roared. "I didn't make you a fool," Stephen answered gently. "You did that yourself." The entire room gasped. Even the gang froze for half a second. Stephen's voice wasn't insulting. It was factual, almost fatherly. And that's what made Razor snap. Razor tried to throw a punch. A huge, full-force punch aimed straight at Stephen's head. It happened so fast the crowd screamed. But Stephen moved even faster. He stepped aside with a fluid, effortless grace. Razor's punch cut through empty air. Stephen's hand tapped Razor's elbow, redirecting his momentum. Razor spun, uncontrollably, and smashed into a table, sending plates and silverware flying. He collapsed on the floor, groaning. The diner erupted in shocked panic. People jumped out of the way. Soda spilled. Chairs toppled. The iron vultures looked at each other in stunned silence. That made 2 times Razor hit the floor, without Stephen even throwing a punch. Briggs snapped. "Get him," he roared. 3 bikers rushed Stephen at once. The teenagers recording whispered, "Oh my God, he's dead, right? He's got to be dead." But the girl next to him whispered, "No, no, he's not the one in danger." They were right. Stephen rose from his seat, finally, and when he did, the energy in the diner shifted. His posture was tall, grounded, centered. His eyes were sharp but peaceful, like a man who had mastered violence but hated using it. The first biker lunged. Stephen sidestepped, grabbed the man's jacket, and gently, but decisively, redirected him into the wall. The man didn't even have time to scream before collapsing to his knees. The second biker swung a chain. Stephen ducked under it, his fingers gliding along the man's wrist, twisting it with perfect control. The chain clattered to the ground. The biker let out a choked gasp before Stephen guided him face first onto a table, pinning him harmlessly. The third biker was huge, tank-sized. He charged like a bull. Stephen barely moved. He placed one hand on the man's chest as he charged and used the biker's own momentum to send him crashing backward, skidding across the floor like a sliding refrigerator. The diner was dead silent. People stared, mouths open, phones trembling in their hands. The entire attack lasted maybe 4 seconds. Stephen hadn't thrown a single punch. No kicks. No brutality. Just technique. Razor crawled up onto one knee, eyes wide with fear now, not anger. What are you?" he stammered. Stephen looked at him gently. "Just someone who asked for peace." Briggs' face turned pale. The vice leader had never seen anything like this, not even in bar fights, not even in biker brawls. His voice cracked when he shouted, You mess with the iron vultures, and you're dead." Stephen turned toward him slowly. "You can still walk away." Briggs looked around. Half his gang was lying on the ground groaning. The other half had stepped back, fear replacing all bravado. But pride is a dangerous thing. Briggs spat on the floor. "We don't walk away." Stephen's expression didn't change. "That's what I was afraid of." And the room braced for what would happen next. For a moment, time in the diner felt suspended, like the entire building was holding its breath. Outside, the rumble of more engines rolled in like distant thunder. The few conscious bikers exchanged looks of relief, even triumph. Their reinforcements had arrived. Briggs smirked, wiping the sweat beading at his temples. "You're finished now, old man." Stephen didn't move. He simply straightened his coat and stepped away from the shattered table. A soft breeze slipped in as the front door swung open. 5 more iron vultures marched in, led by a massive man in a long leather coat, the gang's president, a hulking brute known only as Maddox. Rumors said he once bent a steel bar in half during a prison fight. His presence alone made the room feel smaller. Maddox surveyed the chaos. His men sprawled on the floor, Razor gasping for air, Briggs looking like he'd seen a ghost. Then his eyes landed on Stephen. "You do all this?" Maddox asked, voice deep enough to rattle the windows. Stephen didn't answer the question. "You should take your men and leave. No one else needs to get hurt." Briggs exploded. "Boss, he humiliated Razor twice, took down half the crew by himself. We can't just walk." "Shut up," Maddox growled without even looking at him. Briggs clamped his jaw shut. Maddox stepped closer, towering over Stephen. He had the mass of a gorilla but carried himself with surprising control, like a man used to being the strongest in every room. "Look, I don't know who you are," Maddox said evenly, "but you just picked a fight with the wrong family." Stephen's voice was soft, almost regretful. "I didn't pick anything. Your men attacked first." "So you're saying all this," Maddox gestured at the groaning bodies, "is self-defense?" Stephen nodded. Maddox chuckled, a deep, cold sound. "You expect me to believe that my boys threw the first punch?" Stephen shrugged lightly. "Ask them." Every biker avoided eye contact. The silence said everything. Maddox's jaw flexed. His ego screamed for retaliation, but even he sensed something was off. No ordinary man took down this many bikers without shedding a drop of sweat. Still, pride won. Maddox rolled his shoulders, cracking his knuckles like breaking tree branches. "All right, let's see what you've really got." The room gasped. Briggs backed away. Razor limped behind a booth. Even the newly arrived bikers muttered nervously. Stephen simply inhaled slowly, grounding himself. Maddox lunged. It was like watching a freight train let loose inside a diner. Plates shattered under his boots. Tables slid aside like cardboard. But Stephen's movements remained impossibly calm. Maddox threw a punch meant to end the fight immediately, but Stephen slipped under it like water flowing around a stone. The massive fist smashed into the wall, embedding itself in cracked drywall. He ripped it free, furious. Round 2. Maddox swung again, and again Stephen avoided contact with just inches to spare. He wasn't dodging out of fear. He was studying Maddox's rhythm, his timing, the small gaps in his structure. To Stephen, Maddox moved in slow motion. The bikers roared for blood, but their voices trembled with uncertainty. This wasn't the fight they expected. Finally, Stephen whispered, "Enough." Maddox charged. This time Stephen didn't evade. He stepped forward. One hand guided Maddox's wrist. The other redirected his shoulder. A subtle shift of balance, a technique refined through decades of discipline, not brute force. Maddox's own momentum did the rest. The gang leader flipped over Stephen's hip and crashed onto the floor with a booming thud that rattled ketchup bottles off tables. The entire diner froze. Maddox, legendary, indestructible Maddox, was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling in shock. Stephen stood over him, breathing steady. "Stay down," Stephen said gently. "I don't want to hurt you." Maddox tried to rise, but a wave of pain shot through his spine. His pride wanted him to fight again, but his body refused. He wasn't used to losing. He wasn't used to being handled like a child. Finally, he exhaled shakily. "Okay," Maddox growled. "Okay, enough." The remaining bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Briggs swallowed hard. Razor looked ready to crawl out the back window. Maddox sat up slowly, glaring at his men. "What the hell were you thinking, starting something like this?" Briggs pointed at Stephen, voice cracking. He disrespected Razor. Stephen shook his head. "I refused to move from my seat." Maddox stared at Briggs, who shrank under the gaze. "You idiots picked the fight and dragged me into a mess you couldn't handle." Briggs wilted. Maddox turned back to Stephen. "You're something else. Nobody moves like that." Stephen didn't respond. He didn't need to. Maddox raised a hand to his men. "Everyone, outside." The bikers scrambled to obey, limping, crawling, dragging each other out. Before leaving, Maddox paused in the doorway. For what it's worth, I respect strength, and you've got more of it than anyone I've ever seen. Stephen nodded once. Maddox's final words carried a strange mixture of warning and admiration. Just hope we never cross paths again. The roar of engines soon faded into the distance. Inside, the diner remained silent. People stared at Stephen like he'd performed some impossible miracle. The waitress peeked from behind the counter. "Sir, are you okay?" Stephen smiled gently. "Yes, thank you." She exhaled in relief. But what Stephen didn't know was that someone in the back, someone terrified, had already called the police. And this was far from over. The diner was quiet again, but not peacefully quiet. It was the kind of silence that followed a storm. Shattered plates, overturned chairs, and a dented wall told the story better than anyone inside could. Stephen stood near the counter, calmly sipping the cup of tea the waitress had finally brought him. The poor girl still trembled slightly, unsure whether to thank him for saving everyone, or apologize for the chaos he never asked for. But Stephen had no interest in talking. He simply wanted to finish his tea and leave before anyone else got hurt. That's when the sirens came. Not loud at first, just a distant wail. But as they drew closer, the sound grew sharper, slicing through the desert air. The customers tensed. The waitress froze. Even the old cook peeked out from the kitchen doorway. Stephen set down his cup. He knew this was trouble. The police cruisers screeched to a halt outside, red and blue lights spinning wildly. 3 officers stepped out, hands already on their holsters, scanning the scene with alarm. A nervous woman near the corner whispered, I only called them because I thought those bikers were going to kill him." Stephen sighed internally. He appreciated her concern, but this was about to complicate things. The lead officer, a beefy man with a buzz cut and a face that looked permanently annoyed, stormed inside. What the hell happened here? Before Stephen could answer, Briggs, who had been sulking outside with the other bruised bikers, saw an opportunity. He limped forward, pointing directly at Stephen. "That's him, officer. He attacked us. All of us." The officer looked Stephen up and down. "One guy did all this." Briggs nodded wildly. "He's some kind of psycho." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "I defended myself. They attacked me first." Briggs scoffed. "He's lying." The officer's eyes hardened. "Sir, I need you to step outside." The entire diner held its breath. Stephen remained calm. Always calm. "Officer, I didn't start this. I didn't escalate it. Outside." The officer barked, hand inching toward his weapon. Stephen slowly stood. His movements were deliberate, unthreatening. He knew better than to antagonize an officer whose adrenaline was already sky-high. As he walked outside, the other officers surrounded him. One of them, younger and more observant, looked genuinely confused. "Sir, those men are claiming you assaulted an entire biker gang." Stephen gave a small, polite nod. "I defended myself." Before the officer could respond, Briggs limped closer again, playing the victim. He snapped, "Man, dude's insane." Stephen studied Briggs' trembling posture, the way he clutched his ribs, the fear barely hidden behind his words. Stephen felt no anger toward him, just pity. The buzzcut officer jabbed a finger at Stephen's chest. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." The crowd gasped. "Officer, please." The waitress spoke up timidly. "I saw everything. Those bikers were harassing him first." The officer snapped at her. "Ma'am, stay back. We'll handle this." Stephen inhaled deeply. He could overpower all 3 officers without even breaking a sweat, but doing so would destroy everything he believed in. So he turned around. But before the cuffs clicked shut, a loud engine pulled up. Everyone turned. A black SUV rolled into the parking lot, stopping right next to the police cruisers. The passenger door opened, and out stepped a middle-aged man in a tan suit, dark sunglasses, and a sheriff's star pinned to his chest. The county sheriff. He took one look at Stephen and froze. His face went pale. "Seagal?" The officers exchanged confused glances. Stephen gave a small nod. "Evening, Sheriff." The sheriff stepped closer, looking at the bruised bikers, then the ruined diner, then the officers who were seconds away from arresting a man who could break half the precinct with a single hand. He inhaled sharply. You boys have no idea who you're trying to cuff. Briggs frowned. He's some kind of criminal, right? The sheriff shot him a glare so sharp Briggs took an involuntary step back. Criminal? That man has trained federal officers, military units, and half the martial arts community on this side of the country. If he wanted you all dead, you'd be in body bags right now. The officers blinked in disbelief. The buzz-cut officer swallowed hard. Stephen said nothing. He didn't need to. The sheriff turned to Briggs. Did you and your gang attack him? Briggs hesitated, then nodded slowly, like a child caught stealing candy. The sheriff sighed. Then count yourself lucky he has restraint. He faced the officers. Let him go. They immediately backed away. Stephen adjusted his sleeves, as calm as ever. Thank you, he said quietly. But the sheriff wasn't done. He stepped close, lowering his voice. Stephen, what did you do to Maddox? He's the meanest son of a gun in this county, and he ran from here like he saw a ghost. Stephen gave a small shrug. We had a conversation. The sheriff stared at him, trying to decide if he wanted the details or preferred to remain blissfully ignorant. Then he nodded. Fair enough. Briggs and the remaining bikers dared not speak. The sheriff pointed at them. As for you idiots, get on your bikes and disappear, before I charge every one of you with assault. They obeyed instantly, scrambling like terrified schoolboys. The crowd inside the diner slowly trickled out, watching the gang flee in humiliation. The sheriff turned to Stephen. You okay? Stephen nodded. I just wanted tea. The sheriff chuckled. With you? Trouble follows the cup. Stephen looked at the shattered diner behind him. Seems so. But before he could leave, the sheriff's radio crackled with a dispatch message. And the next words made Stephen turn his head sharply. Because someone, somewhere, had just put out a warning. A warning about him. The sheriff's radio crackled again, louder this time. A dispatcher's strained voice cut through the desert air. All units, be advised, possible fugitive matching Steven Seagal's description heading east on Highway 42. Approach with caution. Suspect considered extremely dangerous. Every officer froze. The buzz-cut cop blinked in confusion. Fugitive? Dangerous? Is this a joke? Briggs smirked like he'd won the lottery. See? I told you he was trouble. The sheriff shot him a look that could have melted steel. Shut up, Briggs. He lifted the radio to his mouth. Dispatch, this is Sheriff Dalton. Clarify that last message. The radio crackled again. Sheriff, multiple calls came in. Biker gang reported a violent assault by an unidentified martial artist. Said suspect matches Seagal's description exactly. Witnesses claim dozens injured. Dalton closed his eyes for a moment. Of course they did, he muttered. Stephen stood beside him, arms folded calmly, eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in a quiet, simmering disappointment. He knew this kind of lie. Cowards always tried to rewrite the story after they lost. The sheriff lowered his voice. You didn't leave the scene yet, and you didn't run. That already tells me everything I need to know. Stephen nodded, but the buzz-cut officer wasn't convinced. Sheriff, we can't ignore a countywide alert. We may need to detain him until... Dalton cut him off. You detain him, son, and you'll be in the hospital before the cuffs hit his wrists. Stephen didn't react. He didn't need to. The younger officer, the observant one, finally stepped forward. Sheriff, if those callers lied, if they tried to frame him, that means the biker gang just weaponized law enforcement. Dalton nodded grimly. They've done it before. He looked around. The remaining bikers had already fled, leaving dust trails on the highway. But then something strange happened. Razor, the hot-headed biker Stephen had dropped twice, stumbled back into the lot. He looked humiliated, but also conflicted. He kept glancing at Stephen, like seeing him through new eyes. Dalton noticed. You got something to say, son? Razor hesitated. His lip trembled. His pride fought every word. Then finally, they're lying. Dalton raised an eyebrow. Who? The boys who called it in, Razor admitted. Maddox told everyone to scatter. Briggs told M to report Stephen as the attacker. Said if we all said the same thing, the cops would believe us. A small shock ran through the crowd. Even Stephen looked at him with a hint of surprise. Razor swallowed hard. I didn't want to do it. But Maddox said if I didn't back the story, I'd be out of the crew. Dalton exhaled sharply. So they tried to frame this man after starting the whole damn thing? Razor nodded. Yeah. Buzzcut officer leaned closer. You know you just admitted to filing a false report, right? Razor lifted his hands. I'm telling the truth now. That's got to count for something. The sheriff sighed. It does. He turned to Stephen. Seems like the universe is trying really hard to drag you into a mess today. Stephen gave a half smirk. Seems that way. But the moment of calm didn't last. More engines roared in the distance. Not bikers this time, but police units responding to the alert. Blue and red lights flickered on the horizon like approaching fireflies. Dalton cursed under his breath. We need to clear this up before my whole department arrives ready for a brawl. He grabbed the radio again. Dispatch, cancel the alert. I've spoken to the alleged victims. Story doesn't check out. Stand down units. But dispatch responded instantly. Negative, sheriff. State troopers already en route. They want to interview the suspect personally. Stephen's shoulders tensed slightly. Not in fear, but in annoyance. State troopers were different. They didn't take local testimony at face value. They followed protocol. And if someone at the state level already believed the biker's lie, this could escalate. Dalton turned to Stephen, voice low. Stephen, if you leave now, they'll think you're guilty. But if you stay, they might try to force an arrest just to show authority. Stephen nodded slowly. I don't want trouble. The sheriff looked him straight in the eyes. That's the thing. Trouble wants you. The engines grew louder. Dust clouds rose from the highway as 3 black and white state cruisers approached at high speed. Everyone inside and outside the diner watched with dread. Even Razor took a step back. Buzzcut officer whispered, Sheriff, are we in over our heads? Dalton didn't answer. The troopers skidded to a stop, doors flying open instantly. For heavily trained officers fanned out with rigid formation. The lead trooper barked. Where is the suspect? Dalton stepped forward firmly. He's not a suspect. He's the victim. The trooper's jaw tightened. I'll decide that. He looked directly at Stephen, his hand hovering over his holster. Everyone braced for impact. Then Stephen spoke, his voice steady as steel. I didn't come here to fight you. The trooper didn't blink. But you will, if I say the word. Dalton stepped between them. You even try to detain this man, and you're dragging the state into a massive lawsuit. The trooper chuckled coldly. We're not worried about lawsuits. He leaned in closer to Stephen. We're worried about what a man like you can do. Stephen's eyes hardened, not threatening, but ancient, like a man with centuries of discipline etched into his bones. Then don't force me to show you. A tense silence spread like wildfire. The officers, the diners, the bikers, everyone felt the electricity in the air. The trooper sized him up. But before he could decide what to do, a call came through his radio. A call that would change everything. Trooper Collins, stand down. The governor wants to speak with you immediately. Private line. Every trooper froze. Collins went pale. He stepped aside, answering the call. And as he listened, his face drained of color, fear creeping into his features. When he returned, he looked at Stephen completely differently. Respectfully, almost apologetically. Sir, my apologies. We've been instructed to withdraw. Dalton raised an eyebrow. Withdraw? Just like that. The trooper nodded stiffly. Yes, Sheriff. Immediately, the state cruisers backed away without another word. Stephen didn't move. Dalton stared at the troopers retreating, then back at Stephen, shaking his head in disbelief. Stephen, what did the governor say to make them back off like that? Stephen looked toward the fading lights. I don't know. And he didn't. Because he had no idea that the call that just saved him was only the beginning of something much, much bigger. The desert night had fully settled by the time the state cruisers disappeared down the highway. The tension that had filled the air only minutes ago slowly melted away, leaving behind a strange, unsettled calm. The sheriff exhaled loudly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, I've been doing this job for 30 years, Dalton muttered. "But I've never seen state troopers back off that fast." Stephen didn't answer. His eyes were still focused on the dark road where the cruisers had vanished, as if expecting something, or someone, to return. The waitress from the diner stepped outside timidly, clutching a fresh cup of tea. "Sir," she said softly, "I thought maybe you'd want this." Stephen took the cup with a warm nod. "Thank you." She smiled nervously, then darted back inside. Even after everything she'd seen, those impossible moves, the chaos, the danger, her instincts told her he wasn't someone to fear. He was someone to respect. Razor, still bruised and limping, approached slowly. "Hey, look, man," he stammered. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." Stephen turned toward him. "You don't owe me anything." Razor shook his head. "No, I do. I acted like a fool. And you could have crushed me. Twice. But you didn't." He let out a long breath. "You're different." Stephen placed a hand on his shoulder, not as a warning, but as a gesture of peace. "Be better to the people around you," Stephen said gently. "Strength isn't about hurting others." Razor nodded, almost ashamed to meet his eyes. Then he backed away, heading toward his bike where the others had long abandoned him. Dalton finally approached Stephen again. "You know," the sheriff said quietly, "that call wasn't normal. Troopers don't get personal orders from the governor unless something big is happening." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think it was the governor at all?" Dalton blinked. "What?" Stephen lowered his voice, almost thoughtful. "Sometimes calls don't come from the people they claim to." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment. "You're saying someone pretended to be the governor?" "I'm saying," Stephen replied, taking a sip of his tea, "there are powerful people watching things we don't understand. And sometimes, they intervene." Dalton tried to process that. "Stephen, why would someone like that intervene for you?" Stephen gave a faint, quiet smile. "I wish I knew." But even as he said it, his mind replayed the fight, the bikers, the troopers, the false reports. None of it felt random. None of it felt accidental. Someone had been following this incident. Someone who wanted him protected. Before the sheriff could ask more, the radio crackled again. "Sheriff Dalton, all units stand down." "Repeat, stand down." "Situation resolved." Dalton chuckled in disbelief. "Well, I guess that's it then." Stephen turned to leave. He walked toward his motorcycle, the desert wind tugging at his long coat, the stars stretching wide above him. The diner's neon sign flickered behind him, casting a faint glow across the pavement. Dalton called out, "Stephen." He paused. "If you ever need help, you know where to find me." Stephen nodded once, a silent promise. He mounted his bike. The engine rumbled to life, steady, strong, familiar. Razor watched from the shadows, still processing everything he'd witnessed. The waitress pressed her hands to the window, smiling with quiet admiration. The sheriff stood firm, arms crossed, eyes full of gratitude. Stephen looked toward the endless road, the wind brushing across his face. And then, just before he rode off, he spoke softly, almost to himself. "Some days, peace is harder to keep than war." He revved the engine once. Then he sped away into the desert night, an unstoppable force, a guardian in shadows, a man who never asked for trouble, but always faced it with quiet, unshakable strength. Behind him, the small diner lights glowed like a memory. Ahead of him, the open road waited. And somewhere, far away, someone who had made that mysterious call watched his journey continue. Because Steven Seagal's story was nowhere near finished.